And now here we are back for some more Got Hockey. And today I'm checking off a major box here on the bucket list of guests that I needed to have on. Certainly one of the second generation, I think I'll call it, Mount Rushmore of the great goalie gear designers. Today I'm welcoming Pete Smith from Warrior and many, many other organizations as well that he's been a part of. Pete, how are you today? And thanks for joining.
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. Maybe what we can do just to start, can we just maybe even just work in a little bit of a timeline, your early introductions into the game of hockey and goaltending, and maybe we'll walk through a little bit of the early phases of you and gear.
Well, it really started. I started playing roller hockey when I was maybe 8 or 9. We'd moved to a new neighborhood, and one of the first kids I met was the first hockey fan I had ever known. So he got me into it, and it was just years of roller hockey, which led to repairing equipment. And then at some point, I decided I wanted to try and make something. And this was all getting towards the end of high school, which was 80, 85 is probably when I started tinkering. By my senior year of high school, that's when I kind of officially got into it and struck up a deal with Vic, the company.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a chance meeting. I happened to be in a pro shop on Long Island at the same time as the head of sales for Vic. And we struck up a conversation, and next thing I knew, I was at their offices, and everything just kept moving forward from that.
And when you played, did you play goal?
Yeah, I played goal. Um, I played originally up until the end of high school and maybe a little bit beyond high school. And then I took all of my 20s off from playing and then came back at age 30. And that was tough.
Yeah.
And from a career standpoint, getting back into playing was the best thing I could have done, though, because it just put me back in touch with the gear and you know, whatever I was trying to achieve with the gear, I could now really understand it by
You can
playing.
test it, you can get a feel for how it moves and all of those things. So I think I've sort of just tried to describe you to most people as almost a bit of a mad scientist when it comes to the way you put things together, the shapes and the cuts that you. I always say that I think what you really have a good eye for is finding a space where a puck can go, or finding a way that a puck can get through, and then being able to sort of in your head figure out a way to sort of stop to plug that hole, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, and there was never like a big vision for this is how I'm gonna do whatever I'm doing for the rest of my career. It was always just following my instincts at that point in time. And then, at different points, you come into contact with different people that could have an influence. And there was never a grand scheme to anything. I always just was trying to do the best job I could at that given time with whatever knowledge I had at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, and I started to venture out from my own business and started working with other people, I began to realize how much I didn't know because there's not a university of goalie
Yeah.
equipment. Pretty much everyone that does it is self-taught, or at
Mm-hmm.
least they used to be. So as I'd come into contact with different people that were also doing it, everyone had their own way of doing things. And it was great once I got to start sort of getting out of my own little shop and talking to other people.
So if we can go into those, maybe into those Vic years a little bit. Obviously, I think the Tom Barrasso pad is probably I guess the most famous, the most noteworthy, or the most sort of visually represented from that era. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just how the whole, I want to call it engineering of that system and how that pad worked, and even just sort of the steps along the way that got you to making a flat square pad.
It basically started again without putting a lot of thought into it. I sort of took on this technique when I was first starting out of trying to make simplified versions of things before doing the real version. And that's what I did with the leg pad. I It seemed too daunting to try and figure it all out in one shot. So I basically tried creating like a simplified version of a goalie pad that was just flat because I didn't quite understand like how the rolls were done, and it seemed like a viable sort of thing when I got it done. And I had spent years playing street hockey with Milik goalie pads that were flat, so it didn't seem that unusual. It's Winlight, and
Yep.
was putting their pad out. And because I was a beginner, and didn't have any confidence at all in my own abilities, I kind of somewhat latched on to what they were doing. Because what I had done, the backside of the pad was basically like a conventional pad, but the front of it was completely flat and the outside roll was completely squared off.
Hmm.
So, in other words, it was a relatively thin pad from a profile view. And
Oh, right. Yeah.
so because I figured, well, that guy must know what he's doing better than I know what I'm doing, I kind of started to go more in his direction. And with hindsight, I wish I hadn't, because I think, the box pad came and went that first time around. And I think it would have kind of lived on more successfully if it hadn't been so extreme, like if it hadn't been so
Right.
wide
Yeah.
profile.
It was almost a little too, like, it was sort of too new, too drastic.
Right. If it had evolved more into what it became, it probably would have been better off. So anyway, that's how it started. And then as time went on, and I gained confidence in my own ideas. At some point, I got to see one of those Winlight pads in person, and while I was intrigued by it, I wasn't overly impressed by it, because at the time, people still wanted their pads to be flexible.
Hmm.
Those things were not flexible. So that's where I started coming up with what now seems like fairly crazy ideas about, knee flexibility with that joint system that I came up with. And, I put a lot of work into trying to figure that out and went through a lot of different iterations, but and it worked. It certainly wasn't a design that was going to go on forever. Like, it was too complicated. And as time went on, pads became less flexible for performance reasons. And so it had its day. And thank goodness Tom Barrasso had the success he had wearing it. So it, even though it didn't have much success at retail, just the fact that Tom had success with it,
Yeah.
validated it, at least in my own mind, it validated it.
Hall of Famer Tom Barrasso. We can say, Pete, you're in the Hall of Fame.
Well, Tom's not in the Hall of Fame, unfortunately. Uh,
He's in this year.
Tom Barrasso is?
Yeah, he's in this year. It was
Oh,
just announced a couple last week.
I
He's
hadn't
going
even.
in.
Oh, that's amazing. Ah, that's very exciting. Well, Tom, if you happen to watch this, congratulations. You deserve it.
Yeah. And so yeah, I think, and for those, I mean, I think most who are going to tune in are going to understand what this is, but that Vic pad had almost like sort of notches with little slots where the pad actually fully articulated together. And that it was, I mean, I even I wore a sort of a simplified version of that. I guess it was more like an intermediate, and it sort of had the almost the suede face with the Gem Pro knee. I had a pair of those I wore. I want to say, I think I bought them used actually around 93. So when I go through some of my stuff and I'm talking to other guys, I can say, yeah, I actually did wear one of those very early box pads. I love them. And then it was like they kind of just weren't there anymore. I moved on. I wore Brian's and I wore lots of other things, but that was definitely a pad, and a season I definitely had a lot of success in too.
Oh, great. So that was made by Vic in a factory in Taiwan. Vic was really one of the earliest companies, if not the first, to start producing hockey equipment in Asia. So that was sort of an interesting thing for me. Like, right at the beginning of my career, I got to meet people from that factory that were visiting the U.S. and they gave me a little bit of insight about manufacturing that I hadn't figured out on my own. Because when I designed those pads, I had only ever designed stuff. I never had any experience in manufacturing. So they weren't designed well from a manufacturability standpoint.
Mm.
So I had a lot to learn in that regard. And that conversation that I can still remember, 30 something years later, stuck with me because they gave me a few tips about like, you should avoid this for easier manufacturing and do this. And, that little lesson always stuck with me. So I always tried to take the manufacturability of a design, much more seriously ever since then.
Mm-hmm. So as you had sort of moved on from Vic, and I don't really know the years specifically, or because I know you've like we've said, you've been a few different places. So maybe sort of from there, can we walk through a little bit on, say, let's say even so right up until Vaughn, maybe.
Well, the thing with Vic is like I was never an employee of theirs. So
Okay.
I always just worked in my own place, whether it was my parents' basement, and then when I moved out, I had my own shop. So it was always just sort of a contracted deal with them. So we had slightly opposing interests. Like I wanted to get a manufacturing company going, and that wasn't that important to them because they made their money from this Asian made stuff. So I was trying to build up a little bit of a company. I don't remember the exact circumstances, but at some point I decided to start just putting my name on it on the gear because for a while it said Vic by Pete Smith, and
Mm-hmm.
that put the relationship to an end. So then I was just on my own. I would travel around a bit and try and find stores to carry my equipment. And
And this was still in New York.
yeah,
Okay.
so I went to college in Brockport, New York, relatively close to Buffalo, outside of Rochester. So I was still doing stuff for Vic when I finished college. I moved back to Brockport. I didn't want to start my life on Long Island, which is where I grew up. So I was still doing stuff with Vic, and then that came to an end. So it was from there that I started trying to find stores to carry my equipment. And at some point, I met the guys at Don Simmons Sports, which wasn't that far away. It's just across the
Mm-hmm.
river from Buffalo and Fort Erie. So that started a long relationship with them. For a while, I was just selling to them. And then at some point, they wanted a more stable situation because they were building products with their own name on it. And they were using Jason Bodum to,
Yeah.
to build their stuff. It was good equipment, but I think the Simmons guys always wanted a little more stability, that they didn't want to be completely dependent on a third party. So they got me to end my business to start up a shop for them. So I did that, and that was a good experience in general. Again, that was one of those situations that put me in contact with people that had a lot of knowledge about sewing and cutting, like where I hadn't been exposed to too much of that yet at that point. So it was a good learning experience. And the other thing that experience did was, for the first time ever, I started building more conventional, old school style equipment, which I had never done. The equipment we were building were basically Lefebvre knockoffs. I'm not proud of that by any means, but it was interesting to see how they built
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Well,
They're
I don't think anyone doesn't know that was at that time anyway, that was sort of their model. That was sort of their how they went about it.
and they were successful with that. I was with them. I I think it was under 2 years. There was a little bit of tension between us, and I like those guys. Like I'd known them for a while. They're interesting guys, and we were friends in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it was also just it was a difficult work situation. While I was there, Vaughn reached out to me, and you know that just seemed like an appealing prospect to go work
Sure.
with. I had never been a huge fan of their equipment, but I admired them as a company and what I knew of Mike Vaughn's background of how he found success and he found incredible success. I admired that for sure.
Right.
And they were just so established and I just imagine that, this could be an interesting situation for me because during that period with Simmons, um, I was watching hockey regularly at that point, and Dominic Hasek was the goalie in Buffalo that I was watching most nights. So he really got the wheels in my head turning again. I almost like at that point wasn't even thinking of myself as a designer because everything that I had tried to do sort of before and trying to improve the state of goalie equipment had all kind of fallen away. I was now just doing what I was told to do but
Mhm.
watching him, he played like as everyone knows, he played such an interesting style and was trying to get the equipment to do things that goalies hadn't really tried to utilize their equipment in that way before. And it really got the wheels in my head turning. And I just started thinking more and more about like what design would allow him to like really maximize the way he was playing. In my head, I just kept coming back to the box pad, but a revised, updated version of it. So I had kind of started working on that on my own time again. And I got to a certain point with it where I had a couple of prototypes and then the Vaughn thing came up. So I went to Vaughn and I brought these prototypes with me. And after like a couple days or a few days there, I brought them in and showed them. Mike didn't really see that as being the future for Vaughn, but I basically asked, do you care if I just keep tinkering away at it on my own time? He's like, sure, go ahead. Again, is putting myself in a different situation. Being at Vaughn, like I had to do things the Vaughn way, and I could see how much success he had had.
Mhm.
That I realized, I didn't want to make the same mistakes that were kind of made with the box pad the first time around. So as I worked on it, it became more and more of a hybrid between something that looked at least semi-conventional with performance aspects that were more updated, high performance.
Like I'm just imagining a time before we had large scale sort of consumption, if you will, by goalies of these types of pads, and then one day you walk into Vaughn holding this prototype, and nobody. I mean, I'm assuming like you had a vision for what it could be, but nobody else really necessarily would have known that that was going to change goalie pads in such a profound way that it just walked through the door one day, and what they were looking at was how that was going to sort of almost change literally almost everything.
But the pad did change a lot from what I brought in
Yeah.
to what it became. It created a sort of weird tension within Vaughn because Mike Vaughn was very much in charge of the place, but he did have
Oh, he
other
still
people.
is.
Yeah, but he had other people there that
Yeah.
had very important opinions that he did listen to. So it created a situation where other people in the company started really gaining interest in what I was doing, and they played a big part in sort of getting Mike to take it more seriously. I've always been very thankful to those handful of people because without them pushing it, there's a good chance it wouldn't have gone anywhere. And then at the same time as all this, not I don't remember how long, but not too long after I started at Vaughn, is when I met Tim Thomas. He was playing just down the road for the Detroit Vipers, in the IHL, I guess. And so our pro sales rep at the time, he had brought Tim into the office, and I wasn't supposed to have anything to do with that meeting. But as it turns out, Tim wore those Vic pads when he was a kid, and that got mentioned. So the pro rep called me into the meeting. You know, he's like, you know, the guy that designed those pads, he's right over in the other room.
Was that Joey?
No, what was his name? Brian Beals was
Oh,
the
okay, okay.
Joey was the Canadian
Right,
sales.
right, right. Yeah, Joey K, the legend.
He is a legend for sure. That guy is great. Um, and so Brian was one of the guys that definitely helped push the velocity over the finish line. So I was always thankful for that. Um, so Tim and I kind of hit it off right away. He was very equipment minded even at that point in his career. So I showed him the prototypes that I had brought with me, and he took them. I think it was on a Friday, and the next day they had practice. So he told me where to go. So I went and watched him practice the next day, and as soon as he got off the ice, he started listing off all these things that I should try, like, to do different. So from there on, he was like my pro co-pilot. Like he was the tester. And that's when I started playing again too. So I was testing him from the viewpoint of a men's league complete hack. And then I also had the pro input. So it
Nice.
was good because, you know, what a men's league hack needs from a piece of gear can be quite different than what a pro needs from a piece of gear. So
Absolutely.
it's good to
Absolutely.
have it's good to have both perspectives.
So it all took off from there. So yeah, of course we're talking about the Vaughn Velocity pad. So we're talking that, like, that pad released, I guess, like 2000, 2001. And I would say that's, like, looking back, even for me, that was just before I got into the industry on the retail level that I've been at. And so we're talking the era of the pads that came out: Vaughn Velocity, Bauer Reactor 6, which was also a pretty early, what we would have called the Pro Fly pad back then. Brian's Beast pad was coming out, which was a much more dramatically shaped pad that they had come out with. I guess Brian Heaton would have been at TPS at this point, and he was just about to release that Bionic pad that came out. So there was some really interesting, sort of exciting. There was a lot going on with goalies and pads and just everything seemed to kind of just be exploding. Like, it was a real, like, a revolution of what was coming. We weren't wearing, the Air Packs, the Pro 90 Z's. We weren't wearing a Helite. We weren't wearing a Legacy or a Vision or those types of things anymore. And suddenly it became almost, even from my end of things, I remember I actually ended up playing in a hockey tournament, and I was playing against the guy who was wearing the Velocities. And I remember in the dressing room, it was like, oh, don't worry, this guy just goes down all the time because he's wearing one of those. Like, I didn't know very much about it. Again, I wasn't in the industry yet. And I was just a guy who had just finished playing, like, kids hockey and just getting into playing with the adults. So it was like, oh, just wait for him to go down and everything. He ended up being a really good goalie, though. That was a game we did not win. And but yeah, but it was a great time for gear and a great time to sort of be a part of it, because there was so much going on. And maybe, so even if we back off of just pads, so on those early Velocity gloves, was that a big part of you as well, the way that design came into
For,
existence?
for better or worse, yes. um, the blocker I thought was quite good, and certainly there were aspects of the blocker that were still sort of carrying on, like Vaughn stuff that had
Mm-hmm.
come before me. The Trapper was really different. I was never happy with it. Um, I put a lot of effort into it too, but it just didn't come out like I envisioned. But strangely enough, it became very popular in Finland and Sweden, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's the
that is,
sort of
no, but
second, that's sort of like the second edition of the V1 glove that we would, a lot of people refer to as the Kipper, the sort of the Kipper suspects, the Finnish glove. I
right.
remember that original one, and just the way that it was so, and this is the thing I would say about most of your designs. If I see something of yours that you've made, and if I don't particularly care for it, if I don't particularly like it, I know I can look at it and go, I know I know he was thinking about doing this when he, and I think like that's the key, I think, ingredient is and which I touched on earlier. I think you have maybe more, certainly as much as anyone else, a real interest in how to take something, make it functional, to make, just to make it work. And even, and again, yeah, even though especially that initial velocity glove really never took off, you do still see the earmarks of it today. And again, like, so I from my standpoint, I could at least look at those earlier gloves and say, I know they're really trying something here. This isn't an accident, or this isn't, they just threw it together. I think this is something like they're really, really trying to nail something down here.
I have always tried to like have purpose behind whatever I was trying to do. Just like any endeavor, though, they just don't always work.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can make the argument nothing has ever worked perfectly. Like that's why I keep
Yeah.
going on. I'm trying to reach some level that I think will never be reached, but in my mind, it's there to achieve. But nobody ever quite hits it though.
Yeah.
So you keep trying. But obviously, like the performance level of equipment has skyrocketed over the last 20 years or so. So, that's one thing that I'm happy about from that time period of the late 90s is that, it created a situation where every company started, I think, trying even harder to really focus on performance. I obviously aesthetics is always a part of it too, but performance, I think, started just getting looked at much more deeply
Mm-hmm.
after the velocity. And, I'm pleased about that aspect of it, that, that's really what it's all about. And, goalies, just the demand of their equipment, it really is such a unique position because there's so little else in sports where the position is so intertwined with the equipment,
Yeah.
and goalies are so reliant on the performance being what they need for how they play, which nowadays is very narrow in terms of the variety of how goalies play. So, which has impacted equipment design, I think, quite a bit. It's all pretty dialed in. Like goalies have been performing at an unbelievably high level for quite a while now.
Certainly. Yeah, yeah. Coming out of that, what we ended up sort of calling the dead puck era, where goaltending was just so good. Defense and coaching obviously was great. Goalie coaching, even from that sort of mid to late '90s, working into the equipment. I think even you saw the increasing number, or the amount of time spent on working on the position, where you had specialized coaching and really some guys who really, really, really dialed it in for how to play, how to maximize your effectiveness. And then that works obviously hand in hand with the functionality of the equipment to work well with the way that goalies are being taught. And you're right, we've seen just the progression to now, where you look at it and you got to almost wonder, well, what could be the next thing? Because it's so, even like, even a goalie who's like, you would consider like a weak goalie, I mean, is like 7 or 8 saves away from being an elite goalie. If you look at, even this year, Aiden Hill went from being a very almost highly sought after prospect, if you want to call him that, at the beginning of his career, to sort of falling off in the middle, and now sort of this renaissance this year where it's suddenly he's sort of gone to sort of an elite level almost overnight, if you want to say that. But it really is amazing to see, and even myself included, I've enjoyed wearing the different stages and different phases and all the things I get to try that all the different manufacturers are producing. And a lot of it, it's funny, a lot of it's sort of the same, but it's still different enough. But it must be getting trickier now to try to come out with things that are a little more original, if you will.
I find it much more difficult now. The fact that the style of play has really narrowed to far less variety than it once was, that closed off a whole aspect of equipment design, because there was one, either just designing a couple different types of pads, or you could be working on something that was trying to suit both styles well. Like there was just more that you could do. And now it's kind of come down to like a few things. Like the lightweightness has almost pretty much maxed out. Like it's to
Mm-hmm.
the diminishing returns to really
Yeah.
try and get stuff any lighter. So you're down to like stiffness, and what can you do to maintain that stiffness for someone who uses the gear a lot. There's sliding, there's rebound speed, and there's, in terms of the major aspects of, just thinking leg pads,
Yeah.
there's not a lot
Yeah.
else.
So maybe we can get go back to sort of your time after being away from Vaughn, going back, sort of doing your own thing, and sort of reinvigorating the Smith name as a brand. And
Well, the early stages of going back and starting Smith Hockey again, in some ways, was the most exciting, just because it was a new start. But also from a designer standpoint, like I said, there's always dissatisfaction with whatever I've done. Being able to sort of start over again and fix everything that I didn't like about what I had done on the velocity stuff at Vaughn, I was able to do, completely deciding for myself what I really wanted it to be. And so that part of it was great. And it was interesting too. It was the first time that I had such constant and direct contact with customers. I really had never had that before then, because I just wasn't in a position to come face to
yeah,
face with customers a lot. So that was, a good eye-opening experience, because it certainly allowed me just to have a much better understanding of where customers were coming from. As time went on, it was just like any small business. Like there were just aspects of it that were complete struggle. During that period, it was pretty much shortly after I left Vaughn. Vaughn, I think, was the first to start manufacturing in China. And there was a transitional period where some people were like, "Oh, it's never going to work. It's not going to take off." And I distinctly remember thinking, and especially since I had had some experience with Asian manufacturing from years before, I just kept my mouth shut, because there were people, on online saying this or that. Like the Simmons guys were very vocal about how anti Asian manufacturing they were. And something in the back of my head was telling me, just keep your mouth shut, because you don't know what the future is going to hold.
yeah,
And I didn't want to paint myself in a corner as being like an activist for one thing or another. When it comes to business, it's important to have some sort of just practicality about it,
yeah,
and not become too much of an activist for one thing or another. So I watched that closely, because I knew this could have a big impact, because there were a bunch of companies out there that were similar size to mine, and we were all doing our thing, and we were all selling at lower prices than what the top brands were selling at retail. And that was at least a part of what allowed us to have some success. And the prospect of equipment being made by big companies in China was suddenly a threat to that. And so, it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of several years, the equipment being made in China became more prominent and it got better. So I started to see the writing on the wall that this is going to be a serious problem, because my expenses were just going up every year, but I didn't feel overly confident that I could keep raising my prices. I was always afraid the sales would just dry up if I raised my prices. With hindsight, I probably should have been a little more aggressive in that regard, but the timing for Warrior to come to me was pretty perfect.
Yeah. So that would have been a, I guess, yeah, a sort of a perfect storm for it. I mean, there is something to be said for being on your own and steering the ship and being your own boss. But if there's a whole bunch of things to do with the business side of things that you're not really that great at, there's also something to be said for letting those things go, letting go a little bit of the control to just focus on the things that you're really good at a company like Warrior, which obviously was a brand that they sort of made themselves, and the parent obviously is New Balance as well, but they really made themselves in the hockey world by seeking out people who they could bring in to add to their already existing infrastructure, who really could make something of the categories and the different types of stuff that they were trying to create. So I always thought it was perfect. I remember a few of their early lines and their early models into goal, and they were all really interesting, the really cool designs and things. And I just remember there was almost too much going on, where they sort of had one line at the top and then they had another line in the middle. They had lines, and I just remember meeting with somebody there at one point, and I said, you got to make the top look like the bottom. And especially at that time, they were still going for NHL exposure and things like that. I said, if you're going to have a Dwayne Rollison, wearing your gear in the league, then you have to allow like the 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old to see that pad and to see the pad on their legs and to see the stuff that those guys are wearing. And it I remember someone had said, well, we think we really like the way we do it. And I was like, well, okay. I look, I've always had fun with everyone at Warrior. And but I just remember when you kind of came in, and I know everything sort of had a bit more of a focus and a bit more of a stream. I was like, now we can really see what we can do here. So with Warrior coming in, like I would say from the looks of things, at least, the gear that comes out looks like it's still very much based on your core designs and principles and the things that you want to do. You've been given sort of the freedom that you need to do that.
Yeah, I'd say so. The Warrior gear that came before me, I don't know this for a fact, but I think on the lacrosse side of the Warrior business, it's, I think, not structured the way you described, where the pro level product needs to look like the senior level, that needs to look like the junior. I think they tend to have very different products at different price points, and so I think they possibly carried that philosophy into it.
Mhm.
And I obviously didn't agree with it. I didn't see any need to try and reinvent the wheel in terms of how product lines were structured within the goalie business. Like, I think it makes sense too that the pro stuff should look like the junior stuff. Warrior has always been great to me. They allowed me a lot of freedom when I came in. Like, certain things I'd have to sort of push harder for than other things. And certainly everybody always wanted the best
Hmm.
for what we were doing. Everybody wanted success, but people have different views of how you get there. So that no matter what company you're in, you're going to face that. In time though, any pushback that anybody was having towards anything we were trying to do in the goalie category, that all just smoothed out over time. As soon as we started having some success and everybody knew that the other were acting in good faith, like there was no real conflict. It
Right.
was everybody just wants to succeed and for us to be the best we can be. So it's for me, it turned out to be a great situation. Even though I was self-employed for most of my career, I did have enough of a taste of working for other people that I knew I could do it. I knew like I wasn't going to have some mental breakdown because I had to answer to somebody else. Every situation has its pros and cons. Like if that is a little bit of a con that I had to follow direction on some things from other people, that was very much outweighed by the support you get working in a company like this and the resources to try and to do what you want to do and being able to work with some very intelligent, very driven people. um, you know in my own business, I didn't have a management team. It was just me and then people that were helping me build stuff. Once I got to Warrior, I had a small group of people that are very smart people all working towards the same goals that I had. So it was incredibly exciting and fulfilling to be able to work like that. I loved it. I mean, since I've been with Warrior for 12 years now, and
Yeah.
obviously, any situation you have your good days and your bad days, but during those 12 years, I literally not once ever longed to be back in my own business again, like
Yeah.
not even for a moment. And the freedom of owning your own business is a little bit of an illusion because wasn't really that free to go on vacations or do anything like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you work for a big corporation, you get well taken care of in that regard. So to me, it's been all positive. Like,
Yeah. No, definitely a lot of give and take when it comes to things like that. I was speaking to someone else. I'd almost put him in a similar scope of sort of for who you are, for what you do, and I had asked him about the differences between being your own company and then being a part of a larger brand. He said, I don't want to have to be the boss and make the decisions. I just want to make the products that I want to make, and I just want to do the things that I want to do, and let everybody else worry about that, and I'll just keep making the good stuff. So it seems like an easy, well, especially when you do find a good fit with people who are bringing you in to do what you do. Of course, is the key probably for that.
it's
Um,
just, it's just like hockey. Being a part of a team is fun. Like it's nice sharing, and when we do have our small victories, like it's great to have people by your side that are just as happy as you are. And when things are going bad, it's great to have support from people that want to solve the same thing you want to solve. So it's just being part of a team, really.
Absolutely. So I will say one of the most interesting things and the most interesting series of things that's come out of Warrior since you've been there, um, the chest protectors with these mechanical moving arms, I know was something when it initially came out. I actually quite like the ideas and the principles and again, it goes back to sort of my admiration of your willingness to try things and to seek out things that work. Can we talk a little bit maybe about what went into those designs and the just sort of how that came to be?
I mean, some of the concepts of the arm part had been floating around in my mind for a while. That I just always thought the concept of the player shin pad was such a valid, good concept that you could take a very hard shot to your shin and not really feel anything. And I always thought, that would be great to have on your arms. It was a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of stress that went into that. We didn't have a full design cycle because it was the second sort of cycle for me after getting to Warrior, and because of when I started with them, it was late in the first cycle, which was the pads and gloves. So we were late, and it just led to having a shortened cycle for the next thing, which was the chest and arms. It was very difficult, but it was also like extremely satisfying as we started to figure out, because there was just so much problem solving that had to go on. And that's where the guys that I was working with, like we really became a team during that, because it just took everything that we had to make that thing work. As the years have gone on, it really just up until pretty recently, our arms have become a little more simplified and a little
Mm-hmm.
more, but I still feel like that product release served like such an important purpose for us as a category, in that it was just so different. It just kind of planted a flag for us that, we're going for it. Watch out. Maybe this product isn't perfect, but like we're not messing around. We're going to try and push this stuff to the absolute limit of what it can do. I do think it sort of elevated us from, people being very unsure about us as a brand to suddenly being pretty excited. And I remember as that product led into the G2, the lead up to it, and as the product started being seen, there was a tremendous amount of excitement for it. And I remember just being so pleased that like people were genuinely excited to see what this product was going to be. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, I that chest and arm pad, although it may not be for everybody, and it
Mm-hmm.
may not be perfect, I did feel like it served a great purpose of sort of, you know,
I think it certainly took away from a little bit of Warrior sort of new kid on the block status. It was something that did sort of establish you guys was sort of something that was clearly your own, and something that seemed like something that was moving in a direction. So yeah, I definitely would agree with you on that. I just remember seeing it, the initials probably at the hockey show or something like that, and just that, this works, and it seems like a no-brainer. uh Build a shell outside, pad it underneath, so that you do. And again, yeah, just like a shin, I probably had never really put it together, like making it almost like a shin pad. And I just remember the initial responses. I think basically it's one of those things where it's like the older you are, the less likely you are to accept something new, and sort of the younger you are, the more likely you're just to go, well, that's cool. And then all of a sudden, here's the thing to try that. I know too, one of the things with chest and arm from Warrior is it's always been very functional. It's always been like a little softer. It's never, a lot of them have never had the bulky feel that some have. It's always wrapped the body well. It's always had good arm mobility on top of all those other things. And yeah, you're right. You guys have done I think a very good job of taking that sort of core design that you had originally, almost blending it into something that looks a little more conventional, just so it's maybe for the older goalies or that who aren't familiar with the way that works. It almost sort of holds the door open for them to sort of come into it too. And I know it's always been exciting kind of to see as it evolves and as it moves forward. Certainly, just much like the pad has as well. I remember like trying to describe to somebody on really any of the G series pads, because I think they basically have all had it maybe since G2, but you have that calf fin that I would describe this to people, and I would explain it, that I would say, well, have you ever had a guy shoot a puck off your calf and into the net? I said, well, and I would just go to the wall or something. I said, well, imagine this is the goalpost. How do you stand? and then they would, with a bent knee or whatever, and I would just hold the pad up and I would say, okay. And they go, oh, I was like, that's Pete. Pete thinks about these things. And I always say, if every time Pete lets in a goal, there's a new design for his goalie pads. He's like, how can I make this not go in?
I guess that's a sign that every time I let a goal in, I was my equipment and not myself.
There you go. Yeah, it
But
must have been. It had to have been something to do with the pad.
that design feature, though, is sort of another example of as the game evolves, certain things just become obsolete, and the way goalies integrate with their posts now, that would be completely irrelevant at this point. So we did get rid of it a couple of models ago.
Yeah, I remember with GT never had it. I remember initially with that one there was, yeah, and you're right, little less and less effective as it is. And I would even say to most people, I don't know if this is going to stop 1 or 2 goals for you a year, but if they're 1 or 2 important goals, hey, it's great. It's great that you have them. Yeah, you do get a lot, and again, the sort of elasticized strapping for the skate, especially toe, and whether it's a bottom, middle, back strapping as well. Like obviously was something that you guys were very early adapters of.
Yeah, I think we were the first with
Yeah,
plasticized toe, and that's become standard. We do it differently than other designs, but our current pads offer the opportunity to do either.
yeah.
Yeah,
I've always had thoughts about the length and the amount of stretch and things like that. I know for a lot of goalies who want a little more, I'm sort of the back one. I'm taking that out of the slot that it goes through for a lot of pads, and there's lots of little ways to manage it. But certainly, again, I guess what I would say, another one of those sort of well thought out. Could we do it like this and have it work? But again, another good earmark of something that you guys have really brought to the table. Maybe what I can ask you about now is something I think that does come up a lot. Are we moving any closer? Are we getting to a point now where Warriors going to pursue maybe being back in the NHL and having the access to that exposure again? Is that something that might be in the works?
yes. It's a discussion that we've always had. We've always sort of, at any given time, have weighed out the pros and cons and whether or not it made sense for us at any given time. There's a lot of different factors involved with making that decision. And some of it has, it could be factory related, it could be sales force related. It's just different things at different times that have sort of caused us to not completely pull the trigger yet, but we are definitely moving in that direction.
And I will say, you guys as a model have been able to maintain a good level of success without having as much of that exposure. So it's certainly from a major brand standpoint.
I feel like we've done something that's really never been done before. We sell at top price side by side with the other big brands, and we've done it entirely on just product approval. Like in some ways, you can make the argument we haven't needed pros to convince people to buy our product, because I think a lot of people see us as being perhaps behind, but we do numbers that are quite significant, and we're right up there with the competition, and we've done it all just on the merits of the product and the bit of marketing that we do. And I think we're all like very pleased about that we've been able to do this, because it obviously, if you can sell a lot of product without doing a lot of advertising, which is essentially what the NHL is, it's a form of advertising. You can be successful without that, you're kind of ahead of the game.
Absolutely. A current product related thing I do want to touch on as well and get your thoughts, and sort of how it became a thing to be, was with G6, the introduction of slide plate. Now I know everybody over the last whether it be 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, actually, have all been trying to make pads slide more, slide better, slide more effectively. And I think you guys have sort of taken that, sort of turned it up to 11 with this new slide plate. And I haven't had a chance to try it. I think what I've said to most people is I'm pretty sure I would try it. And just because of like, partly probably that I'm old and unwilling to change, that I may not actually stick with it, but I certainly think trying it would certainly be a worthwhile endeavor. Do you want to talk maybe just a little bit about how we arrived there?
Yeah, I mean, the key to it is what we found really attractive about the concept was it needed to be removable. We knew that right from the start. So what that does is it gives you an extreme slide that if you take the time to adjust to it, you absolutely are going to use less energy. And then if you remove it, you still have a good sliding pad, but it's
Hmm.
not extreme anymore. So it really gives an opportunity that no other pad gives, that you have like two very distinct options. And the sliding with it, I think, is incomparable. Like, I don't think anything comes close to it, and it's really
From
just a
what
matter.
I've heard, it's pretty substantial. And I know you guys did a lot of testing. When I had Kirk on, we talked quite a bit about it, about how he even felt it was a slight adjustment, but still got there. But yeah, I think so.
Yeah, there's definitely an adjustment. You really, as a goalie, have to decide, do I think it's worthwhile to try and make that adjustment? Because if you can make the adjustment, you're just going to move that much quicker, that much more efficiently, and use that much less energy. So to me, it's worthwhile to try and get used to them. But
Hmm.
if you can't, or you're unwilling, then it's still a great pad with great slide, just more conventional slide.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Now, so obviously we didn't have a new pad glove blocker product launch for this year. We've streamlined it more into sort of one family now, but you have sort of two styles of the same family. So that makes it probably a little bit easier to go from that standpoint. Are we already looking ahead to what's going to be available next year? Is there anything tidbit you want to maybe share that's maybe coming down that we can start getting excited about?
Will be a G7. It's done. It's been done. It's being shown now, and it's getting great response from the stores that we've shown it to, and we're very excited about it. It's basically just really improving upon the base that we already had, and the performances. There's definitely some performance benefits that weren't there on G6 that we're happy with, and I can't, because G6 is still out. I can't like get too far into it, but we're very pleased with it, and I think it'll do well.
Great. Well, I mean, I'm always excited to see new stuff. I think I will be seeing the guys soon, maybe even next week, actually. So good timing for when this is going to come. So we probably picked a great time to talk. I listen. I mean, we've covered so much ground already, and I want to thank you a lot for doing this today. Again, like I said, it was definitely a name on the list that I needed to cross off, and this ended up being a great opportunity to do so. So, thanks again, Pete. Best of luck with everything that comes up in the future. Hopefully, we'll end up seeing each other again soon, and we can talk more shop. And yeah, I can't wait to see what else is coming new from Warrior. Thanks again.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you having me.